So just before we begin with questions, I thought it would be helpful just to give a brief overview of branding in Canada, because I know we have Americans, we have Canadians here, and for cross-border business, it's really important to understand the significant distinctions between U.S. Branding, California, for example, and the environment in Canada. And in order to do that, we actually have to sort of go back to understand a little bit about the origins of the branding law. I'm not going to take too long, but I'll go back into a bit of the origins, a bit of where we are today, and a bit of some of the complexities going forward, and that will contextualize some of our discussion about how to build effective brands and what the markers of effective brands are going to be. So in Canada, the branding of cannabis derives from tobacco law. And you have to go back to the federal government's efforts to stymie tobacco advertising in the 1990s to understand why we are in such a restrictive environment today in cannabis. So in the late 1990s, there was a new scheme devised by the federal government to outright ban all advertising by tobacco companies. That was challenged and went to the Supreme Court of Canada, which struck down that ban as being too broad. So the government tried again, and then in the 2000s, they had a new scheme, and that new scheme went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, which upheld the new scheme. That new scheme is the basis for all of the laws that govern cannabis advertising in Canada. And it's also the basis for the three key areas of branding that the government now identifies and that inform all branding decisions by companies who want to advertise in Canada. So on the one hand, you have what's called lifestyle advertising. Then you have brand preference advertising, and you have informational promotion. So what the federal government did is basically sideline lifestyle advertising, which means advertising that associates tobacco, and now cannabis, with any form of positive or negative emotion about a lifestyle or an image about a lifestyle or a way of life. So it's an extremely broad provision that has leaves a lot of discretion to the regulator, which is Health Canada, to interpret brands and advertising as falling in that category and therefore as illegal. Then you have on the other side of that fence is the brand preference. So you can promote your choice of your brand over another brand, and information about smoking in the case of tobacco, but in cannabis, information about cannabis. And that's actually quite an important provision in cannabis because, as we all know, there's not a lot of information out there for the average consumer, and there's a big opportunity there. So one of the complexities derives from, well, what's the difference between promoting brand preference and promoting a lifestyle? And that's something that remains open today. Some examples of how some of these extreme provisions have been interpreted include age gating on websites. So unlike tobacco, cannabis brands are entitled to advertise through what's called telecommunications, so that's social media online. However, Health Canada has recently issued a bulletin that says age gating is an insufficient protection because the companies that wish to advertise in this manner are required to take reasonable steps to prevent young people from accessing that advertising, and age gating has been considered to be unreasonable. So now there has to be a complete revamp because most of all the brands right now are advertising online using the simple, how old are you? And Health Canada said that's not good enough, but they also haven't provided any direction as to what is acceptable. So we're looking at third-party companies right now with identity verification, that sort of thing. Depicting people is illegal. So a kind of hilarious example was the New Brunswick cannabis monopoly. So this is a provincial government entity. On their website, advertising cannabis showed some people who were socializing. They weren't smoking cannabis. They were just socializing and appearing to have fun. And Health Canada says that you can't depict a person, and that's depicting a lifestyle. You can't have that on your website at all. And so you can't have those kinds of depictions anywhere on websites or advertising that represents or sells cannabis or cannabis accessories, which is interpreted fairly broadly as anything that could be used in the consumption of cannabis. So that's That's where the federal regulations kind of come and go. Then there's the provincial schemes, which are actually based instead of on tobacco, they're based on liquor. And so most of the time, the provincial governments are interested in what's going on in the retail shops, but they've actually created these provisions that are a little more broad, and they prohibit advertising of cannabis anywhere where a young person is present. So that's perhaps even broader than the federal restriction which prevents advertising where a young person is permitted by law. That's another layer of advertising. They also require anyone who wants to market to get a license and actually go through a process of what's called a fit and proper analysis, which is a very discretionary analysis where the regulator will determine whether you are the appropriate individual to advertise cannabis. So history in the cannabis space pre-legalization could be a barrier to having the right to advertise and market cannabis under a license provincially as well. And then the province imposes this sort of alcohol-like restrictions internally into retail spaces, such as prohibitions on entertainment in the retail space. So that's basically the regulatory environment very, very quickly. In terms of the future, and this is my last point before getting into the panel, there's two key aspects to understanding where branding is going to go in Canada in the future. One is understanding the attitude of Health Canada to interpreting its discretionary powers under the federal statute. So those bulletins that it's released, such as age gating, that's helpful, but they've been extremely reticent to provide any guidance. So you can even have an instance where very large companies such as Aurora or Canopy are creating branding campaigns, advertising campaigns. They want to get it vetted against Health Canada, and Health Canada won't actually say yes or no. They'll just say, it's up to you to figure out what these laws means, and this isn't prescriptive. And then they'll come down later if they decide that it's not acceptable. So that's sort of stage one, is just paying attention to their bulletins and any inside knowledge about how they've interacted with other LPs. And then the second half is actually our Constitution, because our Constitution, just like the US Constitution, has a free speech provision. And the free speech provision protects what's called commercial speech. And even though that speech is seen as less value than traditional speech, it is protected. And so when you, as we have done, if you go through all the case law and understand what that actually means, it means that the federal government's laws cannot be overbroad. So the rule is if they restrict the use of commercial speech, which is undoubtedly what's happening here, they have to minimally impair that right, and that restriction must be proportional. So if you actually go through the laws that exist today, there's quite a few, such as the prohibition on advertising where young people are not permitted by law, that may be overbroad, because the purposes of the law may actually be able to be achieved without actually that level of restriction. So that's something that we will see develop in the future, and there are large companies and small companies looking at enforcing and relying on those rights in developing their brands. So that's just the legal context, and now I'm going to stop talking and pass it over to the panel. And I think maybe let's start with a relative softball, just so that we can understand what are the similarities and differences in branding cannabis versus some of the more traditional industries, liquor being an example or another example. So I don't know who wants to, George, you want to take that?
Sure. And I think, understanding the regulatory markets, restrictions on cannabis is very important. I think in Canada there's a vested interest in protecting consumer health. In America it's probably going to be more vested in protecting corporate health. So we'll probably be a little bit less restrictive as the market evolves in the U.S. But, at the end of the day, this is a CPG industry, and it is all about brands. Brands. It's not might be about brands, it is going to be about brands. And we're in an environment where in 2014, 2015, those brands were really the strains, and nobody owned them, and there was a lot of inconsistency between them. And then you started seeing companies like Dixie, Wana Brands, and a lot of other companies start to build national brand platforms. But there's still only a handful of those companies that are really in that space. And when you look at alcohol making the investments they are in the space, and they are some of the wealthiest privately held companies in the world that are going to be coming into this market, it comes down to two things. It comes down to, what are you selling? And you're selling an experience. And so how do you want people to feel about your brand? That's really what brand becomes, is how do people feel when they experience your product? And then how are they going to market that? And it's a pretty straightforward formula with the alcohol companies, is that they just spend a boatload of money. Typically, the automotive industry is spending about 2 to 5% of their gross revenues on advertising. Packaged goods spend about 8 to 10%. Alcohol companies spend as much as 20% of their annual revenues on advertising. They spend $2 billion a year, most brands themselves in the U.S., on advertising.
Anyone else want to jump in on any of those points of differences between other industries and cannabis?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. I spoke on a panel, the branding panel in LA earlier in the year, and there's so many things I wanted to say that I thought about afterwards. First, let me just say I am not a branding expert by any stretch of the imagination. I worked in an agency early on, decades ago, early in my career. But for me, whether we're talking about cannabis, or we're talking about CBG, or we're talking about alcohol, we're talking about a brand, I started thinking about what is a brand, and that's the question I was asking myself when I got asked at the last minute to talk on this panel. And that's kind of what I want to talk about right now, is to think about what is a brand. And a brand for me, regardless of the industry, is a feeling. And so how does that brand make you feel? And I was thinking about, like, what are those brands? I think about, Disneyland, for example, the happiest place on earth. Fun. That's a fun brand. I think about Nike. Just do it. I'm like, oh, God, aspirational. I want to put on my running shoes, and I want to go for a run. I think about Red Bull. I think, oh, God, just, get wings. It gives me energy. And so I think in terms of, I do think in cannabis it is an absolute brand play at this point, and it's about brands. But where we need to start from, as you're building your brand, you need to think about the product first. What are the products that I'm creating? And I really feel like building a brand is an absolute privilege, not necessarily a right. And you have to get the product right. And so it's such a nascent industry and with such early products still, as we're building our products, and we're an effects-based products company, we create products for sleep, pain, mood, what else? Sleep, pain, mood, and libido, anxiety. And I'm not the best public speaker, but I do get jazzed up when I start thinking about this stuff. And what we have to do at the end of the day is create products that solve problems for people and make people feel good. And if we do that, then we get the opportunity to create a brand, because if we're solving a problem, we're making people feel good. And if for example, with our company, if we help, our mission statement is helping people alleviate their reliance on pharmaceutical and alcohol and give them healthier alternatives to pharmaceuticals and alcohol. And if we can do that, and if we can give, the way we talk about our brand in terms of the feeling is giving people that permission to feel good, giving people permission to have wild sex, giving people permission to have some fun, be creative, giving people permission to have, freedom from pain. And so if we can create great products, and I think what we need to do as an industry is make sure that we're creating these efficacious products that absolutely work and deliver on the product promise. And if we deliver on the product promise of the things that we're saying, and we make people feel good, and we're solving your problems, then we get the opportunity to build a brand. And anyway, I thought a lot about that the last couple days, and I think that's what we need to be focused on as a cannabis industry, is creating efficacious products. Because we can get people to buy products once, and if they're delicious and they do what they say they're going to do, then, and only then, do we get the opportunity to create a brand and to create a beloved brand. But that's what I wanted to say on my high horse that I got really excited about yesterday and this morning thinking about it. And that's what we need to be focused on, is creating great products.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because we're in a very nascent stage right now. And we don't know what the R&D is going to show us about capabilities too. So as we learn more, there will be new brand opportunities as well when we understand how to isolate the effects, and also as we improve our manufacturing processes to ensure consistency and that sort of thing, which seems to be the baseline requirement for a brand. But I wanted to sort of push it to Paul. Sort of two questions. One is, from your perspective, what are the opportunities right now in building a brand? And then two, and then I think we'll go to John after this too. We'll start with Paul. And then two, what are the, in your view, what are the markers of a success, what will be a successful brand as opposed, because everyone's trying to brand, right? So what's the difference between those that are actually going to make a difference and establish themselves?
So I think that with any brand, there's a certain foundation. And if you ask everyone in the room, everyone's going to have a different view of what a brand is and how they feel about Nike or Disney, but generally people like those two. So to me, the foundation is your name tells you in 1 second what you do and what it's about. And that's what we try to capture with California. It's like a California vibe. People know that California makes good weed. People on the East Coast have been smoking it for the last couple of decades, so it's got a good natural brand already built in. And we try to just capture the vibe, the color, the energy of California, so that when you look at it, you feel good about it. Obviously, making great products is like the most important part, because without a great product, it doesn't matter what your name is. And like everything from like, so I live California, like I have it tattooed on my arm. And I don't tattoo other companies on my arm. So like my commitment to it is obvious.
So you're getting a burb tattoo after this show here.
There you go. So my commitment is obvious to like everyone on my team and whoever I'm talking to. And that translates to having the whole package, and so everyone feels comfortable with what you're doing. So the website flows with the emails, the salespeople, when they call, they have a certain confidence about the product that they represent, and it all has to flow for your brand to have a chance. And you have to be at it for a long time. You have to just have a long-term mindset, because no brand is built overnight. Even though what Troy referred to at the beginning, when I built this app, we made a brand hot overnight. It's DJ Khaled, by the way. I built a brand overnight by leveraging a lot of people that already had a good brand. So Diddy, DJ Khaled, Tony Hawk, Jamie Foxx, Jeremy Piven, they already have an amazing brand. They've built that over a long period of time. And when they all started tweeting about it on one day, suddenly we're trending on Twitter, and we're trending in the app. We're top 10 downloaded in the App Store. So you can make a brand hot, but it's not really sustainable. You could have like marketing stunts and stints and do things to capture people's attention for a second. And if you could continue to do that over a long period of time, you could build out a brand.
Interesting. And just before I get to John, I want to contextualize this. So John will have a good perspective on how to do this in Canada, because celebrity endorsements are illegal here, right? So you can't actually have that kind of influencer trend developing Canada in the same way. There have been some creative attempts to deal with that, such as naming strain names after song names, like the Tragically Hip has a strain coming out that's named after one of their songs. But John's actually building his brand in Canada, and he has to deal with our weird regulatory environment. So I'm curious, from your perspective, John, what are the opportunities and markers of a successful brand in your context?
Yeah, I think that having a niche, and as Paul said, they do it with California, we do it with BC Bud, so we're authentically passionate about the region that we operate in. And so for us, we've, keeping in mind the sort of three pillars to, the regulations, keeping it out of the hands of minors, the health and wellness of Canadians, and obviously eliminating the black market. We kind of do as close check on everything we put out. Fortunate to have the founders of our company. We've had a long and successful sort of relationship with the federal government, having gone through the federal licensed dealer licensed lab business. So you kind of get to know sort of how to speak to them and how to get through and actually be effective. But our niche, for example, is apparel. So we identified a market that was making, merch or swag, $30 T-shirts that end up in your gym bag and then in the trash and in the landfill. And we thought we could do that better by making actually, nice fashion apparel, custom-made, cut-sew design. Everything's made right here in Canada. And then giving a chance for people to purchase that online. And if an influencer wants to buy a sweater and represent it, there's been no financial transactions taking place, but the brand is getting out. And obviously, for us, we're very mindful of how we've designed that. So there's no sayings, there's no promotion of excitement in what we put on T-shirts. It's just burb, and we've just taken care to get the fit and colors and everything else right. So I think having a niche and having an identity and being authentic is very important when you're trying to build a brand.
I want to jump in and
Yeah, I was
kind
gonna
of
ask you
circle
to do
back
that.
on something that Jennifer and Paul both brought up about making sure you have a quality product. I mean, that is bar none the baseline for getting into the space. But I launched a trade show called Healthy Beverage Expo back in 2012, and I really had a lot of exposure to the canned bottled segment of the beverage industry, and it is brutal. And most of the best products never make it to market because by the time that they get bottling time and they pay for shelf space and they're on page 33 of the distributor's sheet, they're calling them brand owners or brand holders because they don't own anything left of the company. And it comes down to is how are you going to get your product into the consumer's hands and make the consumer aware of your product. And this, going back to what you brought up about the restrictions on advertising, creates a big problem for our industry. The companies that are going to survive in this space are going to be spending 20+% of their annual revenues on advertising today. And they're going to continue to do that until the market has fully matured and the top brands are left in the space. And there are plenty of advertising opportunities out there. Now, some of the stuff that is gate aging people, and we have a lot of cannabis media assets, Mary Jane, High Times Dope, Culture, MJ Link, which not to make a shameless plug for, but there's a lot of media opportunities out there for people to advertise and sell upstream to the consumers. And a lot of the people that are launching products in this space always talk about how they want to create activations with the bud tenders. And I felt when I took over Dope Magazine, one of the most important things is that we need to make the bud tenders' influence in the store less relevant by pushing that information upstream to consumers. And people who are joining onto our platform or joining onto High Times or onto Dope Magazine or any of these other platforms have already opted in to say that they're interested about cannabis. And it is the perfect place for you to get information about your products out to these people. And some of them aren't gate aged. I mean, some of them actually have where you have to register for the site, so you have a deeper layer of protection to keeping this out of the hands of minors.
Those are all really good points. So I'm interested then as well, and I'm sure everyone else is. There's sort of two questions here. One is, are there metrics to measure the success or potential success of a brand right now or a nascent brand? And two, is there a particular aspect or sector in cannabis that you think is a better place in which to build a brand than others? And I know, I think I'll start with George and then go to everyone else because you have a broader perspective from multiple brands, and then we'll go maybe to everyone else. Yeah,
and I have a different perspective from it from people like the panel up here that's actually creating a product that they're selling to the consumer. And I think that there's a lot of conversation about beverage. I know that there's companies that are trying to alter the intoxication profile so that it can more closely match our favorite social lubricant called alcohol. So people can go into that social environment and consume it over a period of time as opposed to maybe just getting one spliff and being high for a couple hours and that's it. You want to be able to create that continual transaction with the customer. And as people start consuming it, there's a lot of information of whether or not you're getting the full benefits from the product that is going and bypassing through your liver and other parts of your system. I do think that we do have, as a society, moving away from smoking. The vape industry is also going to probably come under a lot of pressure in the years to come. And people are going to look more for sublingual and consumable products, edible products, beverage products.
So Jennifer, maybe we'll get to John in a second, but you haven't weighed in actually on the wellness space in relation to that question, right? Because obviously you were talking about creating a feeling, sort of like a lifestyle, but let's say a feeling, a consumer understanding. And then below that is a product. So, in your mind, what's distinct about the wellness space in terms of opportunities? How would you measure success in creating a brand in cannabis wellness?
So metrics are next to impossible to get in the cannabis space. So if anybody tells you they have lots of consumer metrics, they don't. I think it's coming, and we have anecdotal stuff, and we'll get more and more information as the industry gets more and more sophisticated. We view kind of our measure of success. Well, let me back up for 1 second. When we started looking at the space about 5 years ago, one of the reasons we got into the space is because we had a friend with cancer, and she couldn't find reliable, efficacious products, and she was just getting crazy high. And so she was looking for low-dose products that were not on the market. And the more we talked to, then we started talking to a bunch of other women and recognizing that there was really no low-dose products out there on the market at that time. And when we were going in and out of the dispensary at that time, doing a lot of research, and it's a much longer question, or much longer answer, but just in a word or two, we saw a tremendous amount of white space in the industry for products marketed and created for women. And by women and for women, actually. I mean, there was really nothing, in our opinion, and for my age demographic in the 50s, there was just nothing that we were attracted to. And that's what we found from our peer group. And they said, wow, if you could create, again, healthier alternatives to pharmaceuticals and alcohol, we'd buy that all day long. And so we started with the white space and recognizing what we wanted to dedicate ourselves to was creating cannabis wellness products for women. And for us, wellness is taking, form factors that people, and particularly women, are already familiar with and already using it. For example, tea was our first brand that we launched, or our first product that we've launched. It's our signature brand. And now we're launching other products. We've got honey shots and we've got other products. But for example, for wellness for us, we'll never do a sugary chocolate bar, for example. I mean, we're going to really stick to the profile of wellness products that are good for you and have other synergistic ingredients along with the cannabis. So we've been very deliberate and intentional about our target demographic. And also, I think, in terms of our conviction around the brand, and I think what's important, because everybody can create products and they can create a brand, but at the end of the day, for us, it's got to be really authentic, and it's got to come from just a place of authenticity and passion, and again, back to the product scrutiny and making sure that these products work. Because if they don't work, people are not going to buy your product again, and they're not going to talk about it. So in terms of our metrics, one of the proof points for us is we get testimonials every day, all the time from people. And for us, that's a litmus test for us in terms of the testimonials we're receiving. And I saw a guy the other night that I met in the bar even here, and he found out who I was. He's like, Kikoko. He said, I love Kikoko. He said, I love your honey shots. And he says, I was just in Cabo on a guy's trip. And he says, there was 20 of us down there. This guy pulls out his bag, and he pulls out 100 of our honey shots in our package, and he brought down to Cabo. And he's like, I'm like, I love our honey shots too. So I mean, for me, because we don't have a lot of analytics, it's out there talking to customers, and we talk to a lot of people, and that's where we're getting our, a lot of our anecdotal metrics. That's obviously qualitative, but we get a lot of them, and it just makes us recognize that we're going in the right direction, focusing on women's wellness. We love men, and we love that they like our products too, but I think it's just really being focused on who we're targeting.
Yeah, those are interesting points, and it seems to parallel some of the other trends in other industries when you have, the mass market CPG high volume approach, which is really going to be dominated by a small number of players, and then you're talking about words like authenticity and passion, and niches, which is a different sector, and I think that's interesting, and it'll emerge in cannabis. Also, John, I'm interested in your perspective on this, both because I know that some may see you as just a retailer, but you're trying to do more than that, and that when you did your design for your shop, you actually brought in some designers that had done work for companies like Sage and other wellness brands. So you're obviously going in to create something more than just a retail space. So can you speak to what the opportunities are there?
Yeah, we're obviously very bullish on the retail space and its ability to create value. We can decide how we merchandise products. We're living in a time where A store like ours is more popular than the products we carry. People come in, they like the brand, they're getting ancillary products like our apparel that they can purchase, interact with interact with us on social and give us that constant feedback loop. But yeah, it goes down to, it comes down to, again, a niche and sort of authenticity in your products. As a retailer, we feel like the provincial licenses are going to allow us to do a little bit more. We're never promoting cannabis or cannabis accessories as we see it. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think in Canada it's way too early to see what's working and what's not. This is a startup industry with a lot of startups, regardless of corporate size. Consumers, they don't care about where you did your last financing at or how big you are. It's quality. It's do I like the products? Am I getting a good experience in the store if you're a retailer? And that word of mouth is really going to carry forward. But I think patience and time and sticking to what you believe in is going to be very important. So it's for us, it's just way too early to tell as it's switched into from B to B to B to C with recreational legalization.
Interesting. So, Paul, your brand has had more time to mature. It's all new, but compared to Canada, you had more time. So, how are you measuring your success internally? And I don't just mean revenues; everyone can look at that. But how are you measuring the success of your brand and internally, and making decisions to develop it and move it forward?
So I come from Silicon Valley, so I still think that way. The cannabis industry is much more interesting because you don't just have a tech website or app. You also have a product that touches the customer that customers try and feel better because of it. So it's both, though. It's like we're launching a weekly delivery to your house. So that's going to be, we're going to look at all the data, how many people open emails, how many people click on this, how many people click on that, how much conversion is there. So everything that could be data and tracked should be, but that's not really the whole story. So the way that we measure it, besides the data, is how people look at it, what people think. Like, I'll just stand in a store and watch people as they make decision on what they're trying to buy, and I'll see what the budtenders are saying about us. And I won't walk in wearing this. I'll just be like a regular customer, and that's like the most real that you could get if you really want to know what's going on and if you want to fix whatever's happening. And I think you could really build a brand within any part of the industry. It's just like you have to be really clear because people don't have time. People are really fast. But just because Canopy raised, all these billions, no one really knows their brand. And raising money has nothing to do with creating a brand. If you guys remember, in 2012, when Facebook bought Instagram, imagine if Facebook offered $1 billion, Instagram said okay, and but imagine if that didn't happen, Instagram would have everyone's attention under 40. Everyone lives on Instagram, and Facebook wouldn't really matter. So at that point, Instagram had 9 employees and $7 million in funding, and so it's really you could do it without raising money at all. You could just start creating a brand, and if you capture the attention, it's going to happen.
So we don't have a lot of time, so what I want to do, and just go through one by one, and what is, in your mind, the biggest roadblock right now to building a successful brand in this space, and what are your thoughts on the solution to that roadblock? Let's just start with Paul and just go through the whole panel.
Say it one more time.
So I'm curious, so the question is, what is the biggest roadblock before you right now to building a successful brand in cannabis space? And then what are your thoughts on a solution to that roadblock?
I mean, obviously it's regulated and you can't do certain things. But I look at it like the more regulation there is, that you can't advertise in certain places and you can't do this and that. The solution is, what can you do and how can you, back to attention, how can you get attention? So it's just the whole, I don't know, to a brand, just the whole thing has to flow. It all has to make sense. It all has to be real. People are really good at telling if something's real or not. And If you're not real, then if your heart's not in it and you don't really believe in it, it's going to translate to everyone else. So I think that's really where it starts. You just start with something you really believe in, and if you're willing to be at it for as long as it takes, you're going to figure it out.
All right, George.
Two quick things. One is IP we didn't talk about, and the lack of IP protection for anybody that is selling a cannabis-infused product in the United States is a huge issue. And there's also a lack of intellectual property ethics on our industry side. I mean, certainly people creating stuff in like Mr. Dank Bar or Skittles and ripping off other people's brands is a problem. And I think that IP is going to be the bigger challenge. I think the regulatory side will shape out. And the other issue is alligator arms and people not being willing to invest in marketing their brand.
Interesting. John?
Yeah, so being a Canadian retailer, it's the fluidity and ambiguity of the regulations. I think that the federal regulators always prefer to lead with an educational approach. You know, one of the things we've done is we've created a podcast that with David Hershkovitz, founder of Paper Magazine, that basically interviews cannabis tastemakers, influencers, and talks about just where we've come with this movement. So it's forced us to be creative. We can't advertise on Google or Facebook or Instagram, being a cannabis company, as you guys are aware. So the rules are very ambiguous, and every day it seems like you're learning something. I'm sure you can attest to that.
For sure. Yeah, Jennifer?
And I see we have 40 seconds, so I'll make this quick. I know I just bashed analytics a minute ago, but we do have 34%. We are the #1 selling cannabis beverage in the state of California, and we have 34% market share from BDS Analytics, who do a great job on the analytics that they can get. What I would say for us as a company, I agree with what was said on the panel, but for us right now, it's money. And so we think it's an absolute race at this point. Given that we have created this beloved brand and we have a tremendous following, and we have a whole lineup of a lot of new products that we're going to be launching. We've launched our honey shots, and we've got all kinds of other stuff coming up fourth quarter and first quarter of next year. It's funding it. So I will be completely opportunistic here. We're raising $8 million in a Series A financing. It's still open if you're interested. I'd love to chat with you. But at this point for us, it's money and running like hell.
Great, thanks everyone. Just before we end, I do agree that IP is a major challenge, and I wish we had more time to talk about it because that deserves its own panel. But just thanks everyone for participating in the panel, and
Thanks,
I hope
Shay.
it was informative.